The key landed on the desk with a sharp, metallic ring that cut through the dusty silence of Caldwell, Kansas like a gunshot. Theodora Callahan stared at it. She did not pick it up. She did not breathe. She simply stared at the small iron key lying there between her and Edwin Graves, and felt the entire architecture of her carefully constructed life shift beneath her feet like sand after a flash flood. "I cannot accept that," she said. Her voice was steady. She had trained it to be steady through years of necessity, through a childhood in Missouri where steadiness was the only armor a girl without a father could wear. Edwin Graves did not move from where he stood. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples sometime before his 34th year, and eyes the particular shade of gray that the Kansas sky turned in the hour before a serious storm. He wore his star pin to a dark vest, and there was a quality about him that Theodora had noticed from the first morning she arrived in Caldwell, something still and deliberate, like a man who had learned long ago that most situations rewarded patience over speed. "Nobody comes in without your word," he said. "That is what I am telling you. That office is yours for as long as you need it, and no man in this town, not Hector Prout, not the mayor, not God Almighty himself if he rides through the front gate, enters without your permission. You cannot give a woman authority over the sheriff's office," Theodora said. "They will run you out of town on a rail." "Let them try," Edwin said, and there was something in the quiet certainty of those 3 words that did something dangerous to Theodora's chest. She picked up the key. She did not know, in that moment, how much had led to this. She did not know the full shape of the trap that had been laid around her before she ever set foot in Caldwell. She did not know the dark past that Edwin Graves carried like a stone in his coat pocket. She did not know that within 72 hours, the hidden motives of the most powerful man in Sumner County would force both of them into a choice from which only one of them might walk away whole. But she picked up the key, and that was the beginning of everything. 3 weeks earlier, Theodora Callahan had stepped off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad at Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in April of 1880, carrying one leather valise, a letter of professional engagement, and the specific brand of calm resolve that women in her situation were required to maintain in public. Her situation, as she had explained it in the correspondence that secured her employment, was this. She was 27 years of age, a qualified schoolteacher with 6 years of experience in St. Louis, and she was available to relocate because the school where she had taught had been purchased by a church organization that did not employ women in instructional roles. She had not mentioned the other part of her situation, which was that she was also fleeing something, though she preferred the word departing. Caldwell, Kansas in 1880 was a cattle town at the end of its first real boom, and the beginning of its complicated second chapter. It sat near the border of Indian Territory and had processed more longhorn cattle through its stockyards than almost any other shipping point in the state that year. It was loud, it was rough-edged, and it had a quality of impermanence that most of its residents seemed to find either thrilling or exhausting depending on their temperament. The Kishom Trail ran nearby, and the cowboys who came up it every spring were not universally known for their restraint. The town needed a schoolteacher because 3 families had moved in since January, each bringing children and the previous teacher, a Mr. Wallace Dern, had broken his leg in February and returned to Ohio to recover, and then apparently had discovered during his recovery that he did not wish to come back. This information had been conveyed to Theodora in a letter signed by a Mrs. Agatha Prout, who was on the town's school committee, and who had written in a hand so small and controlled it looked like wire fencing. The letter had not mentioned Edwin Graves. Theodora met him within 4 hours of arriving, though met was perhaps too gentle a word for the encounter. She was standing outside the general store managed by a Mr. Calvin Doss, attempting to arrange for her trunk to be carried to the boarding house run by Mrs. Hetty Mallory, when a man on horseback cut too close to the boardwalk at speed and the spray of dirt and gravel from his horse's hooves caught the hem of her gray traveling dress and coated it thoroughly. She turned. She was going to say something measured and correct. She was good at measured and correct. But the man who rode up behind the first man and hauled him back by the collar before the horse had fully stopped was not the kind of man you stayed measured around. And something about the immediate authority with which he handled the situation, pulling the rowdy rider off his horse, speaking to him in a low voice that carried the weight of law without requiring volume, pointing toward the far end of the main street with an expression that communicated exact and specific consequences, made Theodora recalibrate her intended speech entirely. Edwin Graves looked at her. "I apologize for that, ma'am. Are you hurt?" "My dress is ruined," she said. "Yes," he agreed with no attempt to soften it. "I can arrange for compensation. That man works for the Hutchinson outfit and they will pay for a replacement if you tell me where to send the bill." "I don't know yet where I am staying," she said. "I've just arrived." "Hetty Mallory's place is the best option for a woman traveling alone," he said. "I'll have Calvin here get your trunk delivered. My name is Edwin Graves. I'm the sheriff." "Theodora Callahan," she said. "I am the new schoolteacher." Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition, though she could not have said of what. "Mrs. Prout mentioned you were expected," he said. "Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Callahan. I hope your first impression improves." It did not improve immediately. Her second impression of Caldwell was of the boarding house, which was clean and respectable but small, and of Mrs. Hetty Mallory, who was a kind woman with a sharp tongue and a gift for conveying enormous amounts of information in short bursts. Over supper that first evening, with 3 other boarders present a land surveyor named Mr. Clancy, a dry goods salesman named Mr. Pettifer, and a quiet widow named Mrs. Alois Thorne, who had lived at the boarding house for 2 years. Theodora learned several things simultaneously. She learned that the town was currently in a state of political tension because Mayor Harlan Prout, husband of the Mrs. Agatha Prout who had hired her, was in a dispute with Sheriff Graves over jurisdiction and enforcement. She learned that Harlan Prout owned most of the land on the western edge of town and had recently begun buying up smaller claims using methods that at least 3 people in the county considered suspicious. She learned that Edwin Graves had been sheriff for 4 years and was, in Mrs. Mallory's precise phrasing, the only man in Sumner County who doesn't owe Harlan Prout anything, and Harlan Prout hates him for it. She also learned, though this was delivered as a casual aside and not an organized piece of information, that Edwin Graves had been married once, that his wife had died 3 years prior, and that he had not shown interest in any woman since, a fact that Mrs. Mallory clearly found both admirable and wasteful in equal measure. Theodora filed all of this in the organized cabinet of her mind and did not comment on any of it. The school was a single room building 2 blocks off the main street. It had 6 desks, a wood stove, a blackboard, and a window that faced east so the morning sun came in bright and generous. Theodora spent the first 2 days cleaning and reorganizing and ordering supplies from Mr. Das at the general store, and on the 3rd day she had 8 students ranging in age from 7 to 14, and she felt for the first time since leaving St. Louis that she had stepped back into a version of her life that made sense. The trouble with Harlan Prout announced itself on the 4th day, when he came to the school himself. He was not what she had expected. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his mid-50s, with a neat gray beard and the kind of surface manners that had clearly been acquired rather than grown. He brought her a basket of preserves from his wife's kitchen and told her she was doing excellent work, and then, in the same smooth register, told her that the school committee had certain expectations regarding curriculum, specifically that she would not be teaching any subjects or ideas that promoted discontent among the town's working population, and that the children of the Mexican families who had moved in from the South should be seated separately and given separate materials. Theodora looked at him. "I see," she said. "I'm glad we understand each other," Harlan Prout said. "I don't believe we do," Theodora said. The children in my classroom will be seated by age and learning level, Mr. Mayor, not by origin, and I will be teaching the full standard curriculum as recognized by the state of Kansas. If you have concerns about my methods, I am happy to discuss them with the full school committee present. The surface manner cracked, just briefly. Beneath it was something harder and considerably less polished. You've just arrived, Miss Callahan. It would be wise to understand whose town this is before you start making declarations. I understand whose town this is, she said evenly. I believe it belongs to the people living in it. He left without the pleasantries he'd arrived with. Theodora stood at the window and watched him walk back toward the main street, and understood with complete clarity that she had just made an enemy, and that she had been right to do it, and that the next several months of her life in Caldwell were going to require significant navigation. It was this encounter that she was replaying in her mind 2 days later when she walked into the sheriff's office, intending only to ask about a complaint she had received from one of her students' fathers, a man named Rogelio Vasquez, whose claim to a plot of land on the southern edge of town had apparently been challenged by paperwork she did not fully understand. She had told Rogelio she would make an inquiry on his behalf, partly because he spoke limited English and partly because she had felt the injustice of his situation with the particular sharpness that her own experiences with powerlessness had given her. Edwin Graves was at his desk when she came in. He looked up and she had the brief, unsettling experience of truly noticing for the first time, though she had met him twice before, how the quality of stillness around him was not coldness but something closer to depth, the way a still river is often the deepest kind. She stated her business. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Vasquez's claim is legitimate, he said when she finished. I know the paperwork he's referring to. It went through the county recorder's office 2 weeks ago, and there are questions about whether the notary's signature is genuine. Questions that are being investigated, she asked. Questions that are being obstructed, he said, with a bluntness that told her he had made a choice about what to say to her specifically, and that the choice was to tell the truth. The county recorder is a man named Fitch who owes Harlan Pruitt a significant personal debt. I sent a letter to the state land office in Topeka 3 weeks ago, and I am still waiting. Theodora sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she had not been invited to do, and he didn't object to it. He told me the children of Mexican families should be seated separately, she said. Edwin's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. When did he tell you that? 4 days ago, when he came to the school with preserves from his wife's kitchen. He went to the school, Edwin said, and it was not a question. He wanted to establish expectations, Theodora said. I declined to meet them. Miss Callahan, Edwin said, and there was something in the way he said her name carefully, the way you say something when you are deciding simultaneously how much to tell and how much to protect. Harlan Pruitt is not a man who responds well to being declined. I am aware, she said. I am also not a woman who responds well to being told what to do by men who believe that authority is the same thing as ownership. The smallest possible version of something that might eventually become a smile touched the corner of his mouth and vanished. No, he said quietly. I didn't suppose you were. She left with a promise that he would continue pressing the Vasquez matter, and a feeling she couldn't fully categorize, a kind of restless awareness, like the air before a thunderstorm, that was not entirely unpleasant. Over the following week, she saw Edwin Graves 4 more times. Once when she passed the sheriff's office and he was outside speaking with 2 of his deputies. Once at the general store, where they exchanged brief practical conversation about the state of the roads after a recent rain. Once at the Sunday service at the Methodist church, where he sat 2 rows ahead of her, and she spent a considerable portion of the sermon noticing the precise way tension lived in his shoulders and wondering what it was carrying. And once, unexpectedly, at dusk, when she was walking back from the schoolhouse later than intended because she had been sorting through a delivery of books that had arrived from the county, and he fell into step beside her on the boardwalk without announcement. "You should not be walking alone at this hour," he said. "I walk alone at all hours," she said. "I am capable of it." "I don't doubt your capability," he said. "I doubt the intentions of 3 men currently in the saloon who work for Prout and who have been asking questions about you." She stopped walking. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that tell me someone is building a file," he said. "Looking for something they can use. Do you have anything in your past that Prout could leverage, Miss Callahan?" It was a direct question, almost shockingly direct. She looked at him in the fading light and made a decision. "I left St. Louis because a man there, a man of some standing, was determined to force a marriage that I did not want. He had influence over the institution where I worked and used it. When I refused to comply, he arranged for my position to be terminated. I have a letter he sent me that contains language which, if made public, would embarrass him considerably. He knows I have it. He does not know where I am." Edwin was quiet for a moment. "What is his name?" "I would prefer not to say." "If Prout's men find the connection, he is in St. Louis," she said firmly. "He is not Harlan Prout's concern, and Harlan Prout is not his. There is no connection to find." Edwin nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I will trust your judgment on that." And then, after a pause, "But I will still walk you home," she led him. They walked in silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself a kind of intimacy she had not expected. Her dark past, as she thought of it privately, was not dramatic by the standards of the frontier. It was the ordinary, grinding drama of a woman who had tried to build an independent life in a world that was deeply suspicious of independence in women. Her father had died when she was 11, leaving her mother with 4 children and a small house in Kansas City. Her mother had managed with ferocious competence, taking in sewing, managing a small vegetable garden, leveraging every educational opportunity available for her children. Theodora had been the oldest and had absorbed her mother's understanding that capability and education were not luxuries but necessities. She had trained as a teacher because it was one of the very few professions available to women that carried genuine intellectual demand. She had been good at it genuinely, measurably good, in the way that matters, where the children actually learn. And then a man named Gerald Whitmore, who sat on the board of the school in St. Louis where she had taught for 3 years, had decided that she would make an excellent wife for him, and had been unable to comprehend that her polite and then increasingly firm refusals were sincere rather than performative. She had left. She had taken a letter that documented his coercive behavior, not as a weapon but as insurance. She had applied for the position in Caldwell because it was far and the pay was adequate and the town was starting over, which meant that a woman starting over might not be conspicuous. She had not expected Edwin Graves. She had not expected the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with a kind of focused attention that was different from the assessing gaze most men gave her. It was not possessive. It was careful, like someone reading something he was not yet certain he understood correctly. She had not expected to find herself thinking about him in the space between sleeping and waking, reconstructing conversations, noticing the precise quality of his silence when he listened to her, the way he never once told her what she ought to think or feel. The crisis arrived, as crises in Caldwell tended to do, on a Thursday. Theodora arrived at the school in the morning to find that the door had been broken open during the night. 3 of the student desks had been overturned. The books she had just received from the county were soaked. A bucket of water had been left to leak across them. The blackboard had been written on in chalk, large uneven letters. "Geo, back where you came from, schoolmarm. We don't need your kind." She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She felt the shock of it, the visceral unpleasantness of violation, and then she felt something harden in her chest, and she walked in, righted the desks, moved the ruined books outside, and went to find Edwin Graves. He came to the school with one of his deputies, a young man named Caldwell. He looked at the blackboard without speaking for a long moment. He examined the door latch, the window at the back that had been forced. He did not offer her sympathy in words, But when he turned to look at her, his face held something that was better than sympathy, which was recognition, the specific acknowledgement of a man who understood exactly what had been done and why, and had no intention of pretending otherwise. "This was not random," he said. "No," she said. "It was not. I am going to find who did this," he said. "And I am going to find who told them to." "Edwin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt them both register it. "We both know who told them to. Knowing and proving are different animals," he said. "But I intend to close the distance." He turned to Caswell. "Get over to the saloon and find out where Pruitt's men were last night. Don't make it obvious." Caswell left. Edwin looked at Theodora. "Can you hold your classes today?" "I can hold my classes every day," she said. "That is not a question." He looked at her for a moment with that careful attention she had come to recognize, and then he said quietly, "I know it isn't." But that evening, the situation escalated in a way that neither of them had fully anticipated. Theodora returned to Mrs. Mallory's boarding house to find a man waiting on the front porch, a man she knew, not from Caldwell, from St. Louis. His name was Thomas Reedley, and he was Gerald Whitmore's personal secretary, and the fact that he was sitting on Hetty Mallory's front porch in Caldwell, Kansas, told her everything she needed to know about the nature of the trap that had been set around her. "Mr. Whitmore sends his regards," Thomas Reedley said, and his voice had the smooth, practiced quality of someone delivering a prepared speech. "He is prepared to allow you to continue your current employment and remain in Caldwell, provided you return his correspondence. All of it, including the letter dated December 3rd of last year." "Mr. Whitmore's correspondence belongs to me," Theodora said. "It was addressed to me and I received it. He has no legal claim to it. He prefers to avoid legal entanglement," Reedley said. "As I imagine do you. It would be unfortunate if, for example, certain information about your reasons for leaving St. Louis were to reach the Caldwell School Committee." He meant Harlan Pruitt. He had found Harlan Pruitt, or Harlan Pruitt had found him. The two threats, which she had believed were separate and manageable, had merged. She felt the ground shift again. "You have until Friday," Reedley said, and he stood up, and he walked away down the street with the unhurried ease of a man who believes he holds all the cards. Theodora stood on the porch until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she went inside, sat down in the small parlor, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to feel the full weight of the situation. The hidden motive behind Pruitt's interest in her was now clear. He had not simply been offended by her refusal to cooperate. He had been alerted to her by someone who wanted leverage over her, and he had provided the local infrastructure for that leverage to be applied. She was to be squeezed from two sides simultaneously until she broke or left. She went to find Edwin Graves. He was still at his office. It was nearly 9 in the evening. He had a lamp burning and papers spread across his desk, and when she came through the door his expression shifted from concentration to something sharper and more alert. She told him everything, all of it. Gerald Whitmore, the letter, Thomas Reedley, the connection to Pruitt, the ultimatum. She told it in order and without embellishment, and she watched his face as she spoke, and she did not hide anything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then he said, "Whitmore, Gerald Whitmore. From St. Louis, you know him." "I know of him," Edwin said, and something in his voice had gone very flat in the specific way that voices do when a person is containing a large amount of controlled fury. "He is on the board of the Kansas Territorial Investment Corporation, which is the holding company behind 3 of the fraudulent land acquisitions I have been trying to trace in this county. He and Harlan Pruitt are not a coincidence, Miss Callahan. They are business partners." The full shape of it settled over her like cold water. She had not been targeted because she was in Caldwell. She had been guided to Caldwell. Someone had made sure she saw that advertisement, made sure the position was available, made sure she came here specifically, because she carried something that both men needed. "They want the letter," she said. "The letter embarrasses Whitmore personally," Edwin said. "But more than that, I suspect the letter contains something that connects him to Pruitt more directly than either of them wants documented." "What exactly did he write, if you don't mind my asking?" Theodora reached inside her coat. She had kept the letter on her person since leaving St. Louis, not because she was paranoid, but because she was practical. She had sewn it into the inner seam of her traveling coat's lining and cut it free again when she arrived. She handed it to Edwin. He read it once, quickly, and then he read it again slowly. When he looked up, his expression told her she had been correct about the letter containing more than a personal threat. "He mentions a shipment," he said. "Land transfer documentation being held at a specific address. He was writing this to warn you away from something you apparently saw, not just to pressure you into marriage." "He told me I had witnessed something I had misunderstood," she said. "I had walked into his office without knocking and seen documents spread on his desk. I did not understand at the time what they were. I do now." "Land grant fraud," Edwin said. "Federal scale. This connects to the Indian Territory border properties that the county recorder's office has been processing." He looked at her steadily. "You understand what this means?" "It means I was not a coincidental target," she said. "I was the loose end." "Yes," he said. "And Caldwell was meant to be a contained location where the loose end could be managed." He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark street and was silent for a moment. Then he said, without turning, "I am not going to let that happen." She watched his back, the way the lamplight fell across the silver at his temples. She felt something she had not permitted herself to feel in a very long time, the specific, terrifying warmth of trusting someone. "This is not your responsibility," she said. "No," he agreed, turning around. "It's my choice." The following morning was when he gave her the key. He set it on the desk between them and said, "Nobody comes in without your word." He meant it practically. He was moving her out of the boarding house, which Reedley and Pruitt's men knew the location of, and into the back room of the sheriff's office, which had a cot and a private entrance. He meant that she would have control of the space, that no one could access her documents or her person without her explicit consent. He meant that he was placing his authority between her and the two men who wanted to destroy her. But the way he said it, the absolute steadiness of it, the complete lack of performance or drama, simply the bare and certain fact of a man who had decided what he was going to do and was doing it, reached something in Theodora that she had guarded very carefully for a long time. She picked up the key. She moved her things to the back room of the sheriff's office that afternoon. Mrs. Mallory, who had been told only that Miss Callahan was moving for safety reasons, pressed her hand and said, "That man is a good one, dear. They're not all bad," in a tone that Theodora found simultaneously embarrassing and entirely accurate. The next 2 days were a careful, intricate negotiation of multiple simultaneous dangers. Edwin sent a second letter to the state land office in Topeka, this time including specific language from Whitmore's letter, carefully quoted without revealing the full document, that he believed would prompt a faster response. He also sent a private telegram to a federal marshal he knew from his time in Dodge City, a man named Arledge who had jurisdiction over federal land fraud cases. Theodora continued teaching. She did this deliberately and without compromise, because she understood that abandoning the classroom would signal exactly the kind of surrender that Pruitt and Whitmore were waiting for. On the second day after moving into the sheriff's office, she arrived at the school to find 6 of her 8 students present, and at the end of the school day, Rogelio Vasquez was waiting outside with his oldest daughter Elena, who was 12 and had been one of Theodora's best students. Rogelio had received another notice about his land claim. Theodora read it and felt the familiar cold anger of someone watching injustice proceed according to its own bureaucratic schedule. She told Rogelio she was working on it, and she meant it, and Elena translated for her father with a quiet precision that made Theodora's chest ache with pride. What she did not expect, returning to the sheriff's office that evening, was to find Edwin sitting at his desk with a letter in his hands and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. "What happened?" she asked. He looked up. The expression resolved into something she could read, not grief exactly, but the residue of old grief that has been reopened. "A letter from Whitmore's lawyers," he said. "He is threatening to file a formal complaint with the county circuit judge claiming that I have improperly seized his private correspondence from a private citizen under my protection. He is saying the letter was stolen." "That is a lie," Theodora said. "Yes," Edwin said. "It is. But the circuit judge for this county is a man named Alderman, and Alderman and Prout are well acquainted." He set the letter down. "If Alderman issues an order to produce the document, I am obligated by law to comply or to argue jurisdiction, which takes time we may not have if Reedley is planning to leave by Friday." "Then we must move faster," Theodora said. She sat down across from him. "What do you need from me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I need you to tell me," he said carefully, "whether you are staying." She understood the full weight of the question. Not just whether she would stay in Caldwell or whether she would see this through, but whether, with the full picture now clear, she was willing to stand in the specific place he was asking her to stand, which was beside him against forces that were not inconsiderable. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not because I can't, because I won't." Something moved across his face, a shift, deep and involuntary, the kind of thing people cannot control when they are genuinely moved. He looked down at the desk. "Theodora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed with the weight of deliberate choice. "I want to say something that is perhaps not entirely professional." "Say it," she said. "I have not," he started again. "Since my wife died, I have not been inclined toward, I have not been open to." He seemed to find the circling frustrating because he set it aside and said directly, "I think about you constantly. I am aware that this is not the moment to be saying that, given everything that is happening, but I find that I cannot be near you without feeling it, and you deserve to know it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the evening sounds of Caldwell went on, the distant piano from the Silver Star Saloon, the occasional voice, the horses, the ordinary sounds of a rough-edged town going about its rough-edged business. "Edwin," she said, and she heard in her own voice something she recognized as honesty, the kind that costs something. "I have been frightened of caring about someone here because I was not sure I was going to be allowed to stay. I am still not sure. But I know that the only person in this town whose opinion of me I have genuinely valued from the first day is yours, and that is not nothing." He reached across the desk slowly, with the careful deliberateness that characterized everything he did, and put his hand over hers where it rested on the edge of the desk. He did not say anything. She looked at his hand over hers and felt the warmth of it go straight through her, steady and specific as a compass finding north. They sat like that for a moment. Then they let go and talked strategy until midnight, which was perhaps, she thought later, itself a kind of love, the willingness to sit across from a person doing the difficult necessary work with you, for as long as it takes, in the particular dark of whatever situation you find yourselves in together. On Thursday morning, 3 things happened in quick succession. Thomas Reedley came to the school looking for Theodora, and found it locked because Theodora had decided to hold classes at the sheriff's office that day. She had moved her blackboard with Caswell's help the previous afternoon, and informed her students' parents of the change. Reedley went to the boarding house and found only Mrs. Mallory, who informed him with perfect innocence that Miss Callahan had left 3 days ago, and she had no forwarding address. Meanwhile, Edwin's telegram to Marshal Arledge received a response. The federal marshal was already in Wichita on a related case. He would be in Caldwell by Friday evening. And at 11 in the morning, Harlan Prout came to the sheriff's office. Theodora was at the small desk that had been cleared for her in the main room, helping Elena Vasquez with a reading assignment while her father waited outside. The children were at the far end of the room with their slates. Edwin was in the back reviewing documents. The door opened. Harlan Prout stepped in with 2 of his men behind him. He looked at the children. He looked at Theodora. His surface manners were entirely absent today. "Where is the letter?" he said. Theodora did not stand up. She set down the primer she was holding with deliberate calm and said, "Mr. Prout, this is the sheriff's office." Nobody comes in without the sheriff's word. The sheriff, Prout said, is about to have considerably larger problems than a schoolteacher with. Edwin came through the back door. He had a calmness about him that was different from ordinary calm, the particular steadiness of a man who has decided how the next several minutes will go and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to his decision. "Harlan," he said, "whatever you came here to say, you're going to say it with these children present, and that is going to be your choice to live with. Or you're going to leave and we'll discuss it like reasonable men at a reasonable time." Prout's jaw tightened. He looked at Edwin. He looked at Theodora. He looked at Elena Vasquez, who was watching him with the clear-eyed attention of a 12-year-old who was going to remember every detail of this moment for the rest of her life. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Edwin agreed. "It's not yet." Prout left. The two men behind him filed out like dogs following their owner. The door closed. The room was silent. Then one of the younger children, a boy of 7 named Samuel, said conversationally, "My papa says Mr. Prout is a snake wearing a hat." And several of the other children laughed, and the tension broke. Theodora looked at Edwin across the room, and the look they exchanged was brief and complete and said more than words would have, which was, "We are still standing, and we will keep standing, and this is not over, but we know who we are." That night was the hardest. Reedley, having failed to locate Theodora through normal means, apparently decided to apply pressure through a different channel. At 8 in the evening, one of Edwin's deputies, young Caldwell, came to the office with the information that someone had told Fitch at the county recorder's office that Edwin Graves had been holding federal evidence without reporting it, and that Judge Alderman had been notified and was issuing a summons for Edwin to appear the following morning. "If you appear before Alderman," Theodora said, "he will issue an order for the letter, and Whitmore's lawyers will claim it immediately." "Yes," Edwin said. "Can you delay the appearance? Refusing a summons from a circuit judge is contempt," he said, "even if the summons is issued under false pretenses." "We need Arledge here before tomorrow morning," she said. Edwin sent another telegram. The response came back within the hour. Marshal Arledge could be at Caldwell by 6 the following morning if he rode through the night, and he was willing to do so. Edwin looked at the telegram. Then he looked at Theodora. "I need you to trust that this will work," he said. "I need you to believe, genuinely believe, that I am not going to let them take that letter and I am not going to let them run you out of this town." "I believe you," she said. And it was the simplest and most complete thing she had said to him yet, because it was entirely true. They did not sleep much that night. Edwin spent a portion of it writing a detailed formal account of the land fraud evidence, signed and witnessed by Caldwell, to be sent to Topeka in the event that the letter itself was legally seized. Theodora spent time at the desk she had claimed in his office, writing her own account of Gerald Whitmore's behavior and the coercive nature of his actions, which she signed in full. They passed papers back and forth across the desk and occasionally touched hands in the passing and did not comment on it, but neither did they pull away. At one point, well past midnight, Edwin set down his pen and looked at her. "Tell me something that has nothing to do with Prout or Whitmore," he said. She thought for a moment. "When I was 12, my mother taught me to bake bread," she said. "She said that the thing about bread is that you cannot hurry it. You have to trust that the rising will happen in its own time. She said that was also true of most things worth having." She looked at him. "Your turn." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. "She died of fever. We had been married for 4 years. For a long time after, I thought that caring about anyone was a kind of recklessness I couldn't afford." He paused. "I am revising that opinion." She did not say anything for a moment. The lamp burned between them. "She sounds like she was worth loving," Theodora said finally. "She was," he said. "As are you." It was perhaps the most direct he had been, and it hit her somewhere deep and true, and she looked down at the papers on the desk and then back up at him, and whatever was on her face made him look away first, which she found she did not mind at all. Marshal Arledge arrived at 6:14 in the morning, which was 46 minutes before Harlan Pruitt arrived at the sheriff's office with his lawyers, and this margin of time was exactly sufficient. Arledge was a tall, leathery man of about 50 with a federal badge and a very settled air, the kind of settled that comes from decades of doing difficult work and knowing exactly what the law is and what it requires. He reviewed Edwin's evidence file. He examined Whitmore's letter. He spoke briefly and privately with Theodora, asking her to confirm the circumstances under which the letter had come into her possession, which she did in complete and factual detail. By the time Pruitt's lawyer, a sleek man named Forsyth, arrived with the summons for Edwin, Arledge had already sent a communication to Judge Alderman noting federal jurisdiction over the evidence in question, and requesting that the summons be withdrawn pending a federal inquiry. He did this with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done it many times before and found the procedure entirely routine, even if the men on the other side of it did not. The summons was not formally withdrawn that morning, but Alderman, receiving a communication from a federal marshal, chose not to enforce it immediately, and in the law, immediately is sometimes all the time you need. Forsyth looked at Arledge. Arledge looked at Forsyth with the specific expression of a man who has the stronger legal hand and knows it. Pruitt had not come inside. He was on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, visible through the window, his composure visibly working hard against something less composed beneath it. When Forsyth came out and spoke to him in a low voice, Theodora watched the moment Pruitt understood that the trap he had set had closed on him instead. It did not happen neatly. Legal proceedings rarely do. What happened over the following weeks was a careful, methodical process of documentation and testimony. Thomas Reedley, finding himself on the wrong side of a federal inquiry, cooperated with Arledge in exchange for immunity and provided testimony that connected Whitmore and Pruitt through 4 years of fraudulent land transfers affecting properties in Sumner County and along the Indian Territory border, including Rogelio Vasquez's claim. Gerald Whitmore in St. Louis received a formal notice from the federal prosecutor's office. His involvement in the Kansas Territorial Investment Corporation became the subject of a federal investigation. He was never prosecuted. Men of his standing rarely were in 1880, but the pressure of the inquiry was sufficient to end his influence over the Caldwell School Committee, which lost its connection to Pruitt as that man's own situation deteriorated. Harlan Pruitt's legal problems accumulated. The fraudulent notary signatures came undone under Arledge's examination. Fitch at the county recorder's office resigned. Several of the land transfers Pruitt had processed were ruled invalid by the state land office in Topeka, including the claim against Rogelio Vasquez. When Rogelio received the paperwork confirming his land was his, he came to the sheriff's office and shook Edwin's hand for a long time and looked at Theodora with an expression of gratitude that made her understand freshly why the work she did mattered. Harlan Pruitt was not sent to prison. This was the truth of the injustice, the part that sat like a stone in the stomach. He had good lawyers and the kind of social capital that absorbed legal consequence like thick wool absorbs rain. But he lost his position as mayor, and he lost the better part of his reputation, and he left Caldwell within 6 months of the federal inquiry's conclusion, which was not justice but was something. What remained was Caldwell itself, and the school, and the spring turning to summer with a generosity that Kansas sometimes produces and which feels like an apology for everything else. Theodora Callahan stayed. This was not a small decision. She turned it over carefully, as she turned everything over carefully, and examined it from several angles, and arrived at the conclusion she had arrived at the night she first picked up the key. That she was not leaving, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had something here worth staying for. The something was complicated and included the school and her students, and the particular satisfaction of having faced down two powerful men and remained standing. But it also included a tall man with gray-touched hair who had handed her a key and placed his authority between her and the people who wished to harm her without asking anything in return, and who looked at her like she was something he was still carefully reading and couldn't put down. The first time Edwin kissed her was in late May, on a Thursday evening, which seemed to be their significant day. He had come to walk her home from the school, which had become a habit that neither of them had formally established but both of them maintained. They were passing the livery stable on the south end of Main Street when she said something that made him laugh, a full laugh, sudden and genuine, the kind that surprised him as much as it did her, and when he turned to look at her, still smiling, she was already looking at him with something unguarded on her face, and he stopped walking. "Theodora," he said. "Yes," she said, which was technically not a response to anything he had said but was a response to what was in the air between them, and he understood it as such. He kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything he did, deliberately, attentively, with complete focus, as if she was the most important thing in his immediate world, which, in that moment, she was. She kissed him back with more warmth than she had expected to find in herself, and it was better than anything. The way the things you have made yourself wait for and not want and not allow always are when they finally happen. When they separated, he kept his hand on her face for a moment, looking at her in the May evening light. "I have been wanting to do that for approximately 6 weeks, he said. 7, she corrected. He smiled at that, a full smile, rare and specific, that she understood was something he did not produce for general consumption and which she felt as an honor. 7, he agreed. They walked home in the evening with their hands brushing and then holding, and the town went about its business around them and paid them about as much attention as a Western town pays to anything that isn't shooting or commerce, which was approximately none. Over the summer, they were careful. She remained at the sheriff's office for 3 more weeks and then moved back to Mrs. Mallory's boarding house when it was clear the immediate threat had passed, and the quality of their relationship was understood throughout the town without requiring announcement, which was the way such things worked in small communities. Mrs. Mallory said, "I knew it," with the satisfaction of a woman who has been proved right about a prediction she made to herself and no one else. Caldwell, the deputy, began treating Theodora with a deference that bordered on reverence, which she found charming and told him so, at which point he turned brick red and went back to work. Edwin courted her the way he did everything, with deliberateness and patience, and the specific attentiveness of someone for whom another person's inner life is genuinely interesting rather than decorative. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He brought her things, not grand gestures but thoughtful ones, a particular kind of ink she had mentioned needing, a book he had seen in a traveling merchant's pack that he thought she would find useful, a letter from the Kansas State Teachers Association about a summer conference in Wichita that she might want to attend. She attended the conference. She was gone for 5 days. He wrote her 2 letters. They were not flowery letters, he was not a flowery writer, but they were honest, and they said, "I miss you in the mornings. The office is quieter than I've gotten used to. The Vasquez girl stopped by to ask when you'd be back. I told her Friday. I find I am looking forward to Friday considerably more than is strictly dignified for a man in my position. Come back safe." She read both letters on the train home and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as happiness, which was a word she had been cautious about for so long that she almost didn't recognize it when it arrived. He was at the station when the train came in. He was just standing there on the platform with his hat in his hand, which meant he had taken it off when he saw her through the window, and the expression on his face when she stepped down onto the platform was so completely and openly glad that she walked straight to him without thinking about it and put her arms around him, and he held her with both arms, close and certain. And she felt the solidity of him and the warmth and the particular quality of being held by someone who is genuinely glad you exist. "Hello," she said into his shoulder. "Hello," he said against her hair. They stood like that on the platform for a moment longer than was strictly conventional, and neither of them minded at all. He proposed to her on a Saturday evening in August in the most Edwin Graves fashion possible, which was to say without ceremony but with complete sincerity. They were sitting on the steps of the sheriff's office after a long week, the kind of week where the town's rough edges had been particularly rough. A dispute between two cattle operations that had required careful management, a family in some distress on the eastern outskirts, an elderly man who had died alone and whose affairs needed sorting. She was tired and he was tired, and they were sitting together in the quiet way they had come to sit, shoulder to shoulder, watching the last of the August light drain out of the western sky. He said, "Theodora, I would like to marry you if you're willing." She turned to look at him. He met her look steadily. "I know that's not. I should perhaps have planned something more elaborate," he said. "I can if you prefer, Edwin," she said. "Yes. Yes," she said. He blinked. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Yes, as in I will marry you," she said. "Yes, I'm willing, yes," he exhaled. It was a very small sound, but it was the sound of someone releasing something they had been holding carefully for a very long time, and she felt it as precisely as if she had been holding it with him. "Good," he said. And then he took her hand, and they sat there in the August evening, and the town was quiet around them, and the stars came out one at a time over Kansas, and it was very simple and very complete. They were married in October at the Methodist Church, which was a modest ceremony by the standards of any era, attended by Mrs. Mallory and Caswell and the Vasquez family, in whose honor Elena had made a wreath of dried wildflowers that she placed on the church door with solemn ceremony. There were other townspeople too, the school committee, several of Edwin's professional acquaintances, the Thorne widow from the boarding house, Calvin Doss from the general store. The Reverend performed the ceremony with evident pleasure, and the words of it were straightforward and honest, which suited both of them. Theodora wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself with Mrs. Mallory's assistance, and her dark hair was pinned up with the two tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. Edwin wore his good dark coat and had his star pinned, and when the Reverend asked the gathered assembly if anyone had objection to the union, the silence was so complete and so clearly contented that Theodora felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was still tight. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Edwin looked at her with that direct, steady gaze, she thought about a woman who had stepped off a train in April carrying a valise and a letter, and the particular determination of someone who has been pushed far enough that they have stopped fearing being pushed. She thought about picking up a key from a desk and feeling the world shift. She thought about her mother and her bread, and the way some things cannot be hurried. And she kissed her husband in front of the Methodist Church and the gathered people of Caldwell, Kansas, in October of 1880, and it tasted like the beginning of something rather than the end, which she had been told was how it was supposed to feel. The winter that followed was their first. It was a good one, in the way that winters together, the first ones, are good, full of the texture of ordinary life arranged for two, of the accumulation of small domestic knowledge, of who drinks their coffee how, who wakes earliest, who is impossible to speak to before breakfast, Edwin, who cannot sleep when something is unresolved and will get up at 2 in the morning to make notes on paper about it, Theodora. The sheriff's residence was a house 2 streets off the main road, a solid frame house that had more rooms than Edwin had previously needed, but that was now populated with her books and her papers, and the smell of the bread she had learned from her mother, which Edwin Graves developed an immediate and devoted attachment to that he expressed by appearing in the kitchen whenever it was baking with the patient hopefulness of a very dignified man who wants bread. She continued teaching. This was not a negotiation between them, because it had never needed to be. Edwin had never, not once, indicated that her career was anything other than her own, and when a member of the new school committee, a different committee, reconstituted after the Prout era, suggested obliquely that now that she was the sheriff's wife she might wish to focus on other responsibilities. Edwin had been in the room, and had looked at the man with the expression that communicated exact and specific consequences, which had ended the suggestion very efficiently. Rogelio Vasquez's land was producing well by the following spring, and Alina was reading at a level that Theodora planned to write a letter about to the State Teachers Association, because she thought the girl should have access to secondary education, which was not readily available in Caldwell. She wrote the letter, and the Teachers Association wrote back, and by summer there was a plan in motion to connect Alina with a school program in Wichita for advanced students, which made Alina's face go from ordinarily bright to incandescent. In the summer of 1881, Theodora discovered she was expecting a child. She was not certain immediately, and then she was very certain, and she sat with the knowledge for 2 days, which was how long it took her to understand exactly what she felt about it, which was afraid and glad and ready, which she had not expected to feel the ready part, but there it was. She told Edwin on a Sunday evening. She handed him a cup of coffee and sat down and said, "We are going to have a child." He set down the coffee very carefully and looked at her, and she watched the information reach him in stages. First the fact of it, then the meaning of it, then something deeper and older, something she recognized as the part of him that had been alone a long time and had finally stopped being alone. He said, "Theodora," just her name, just the one word. She moved to the chair beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat together in the lamp light of their front parlor, while the Kansas evening went by outside, and she felt him breathe, steady and slow and real, and it was exactly enough. The child, a boy, was born in February of 1882, arriving in the world with the loud, immediate conviction of someone who intends to make his presence known. They named him James, after Edwin's father, with a middle name of Thomas after Theodora's favorite book's author. Or so she told people, though privately it was because she liked the way James Thomas Graves sounded when said quickly, like a small ceremony in itself. Edwin Graves with a child was something she had not fully prepared for, and it turned out that the careful attentiveness he gave to everything he did was entirely transferable to infant management. And James, who might have been expected to be indifferent to his father's quality of stillness, seemed instead fascinated by it. He would stop crying mid-cry when Edwin picked him up, which Mrs. Mallory said was extraordinary, and which Caswell, visiting to see the new baby, declared to be some kind of sheriff's power, a theory that nobody could entirely disprove. The months after James was born had the quality of life settling into itself, not the stillness of stagnation, but the settling of something that has found its right shape. Theodora returned to teaching in the spring, and James was kept in the mornings by Mrs. Thorne, the widow from the boarding house, who had become a reliable friend and who adored James with a thoroughness that Theodora found both touching and useful. Edwin's work continued. The law in Caldwell was never short of occasion, but the texture of it had changed since Prout's departure, less about the grinding accumulation of institutional obstruction and more about the ordinary, manageable business of a town finding its feet. The Vasquez family remained in their lives as something between neighbors and family. Alina went to the program in Wichita for a semester and came back speaking in sentences that her father received with bewildered, radiant pride. She wanted to be a teacher, she said. She wanted to do what Miss Callahan, she never stopped calling her that, had done for her. Theodora, sitting at the kitchen table with Alina's letter in her hand, felt the particular satisfaction of a seed planted in difficult ground that had not only grown but was planting further seeds, and she thought that this specific quality of return was what made the work worth doing, not just the doing of it. In the autumn of 1883, there was one more moment of crisis, smaller in scale than the one that had brought them together, but pointed in its own way. A man came through Caldwell on his way west. He stopped at the saloon and mentioned, in conversation, that he had come through St. Louis, and that there was news of a man named Gerald Whitmore who had been implicated in a larger fraud case connected to Eastern land investment. Whitmore, the man said, had left the country for a time to Europe to wait out the inquiry. Edwin told her this in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning. She received it the way she had received every piece of information about that chapter of her life, cleanly, without ceremony. "Good," she said. "He should know what it feels like to leave." "Are you all right?" Edwin asked. She considered the question genuinely, as she always did. "Yes," she said, "I am very all right." She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man who had given her a key, and said nobody comes in without your word, at the man who had placed himself between her and the forces that wanted to diminish her, at the man who was currently holding their son with one arm while trying to read the morning paper, and managing both with characteristic competence. "I am better than all right, Edwin. I am extremely all right." He set down the paper. He looked at her. "Good," he said, and the smile was there again, the rare and specific one. She went to teach her students. He went to do his work. James, deposited with Mrs. Thorne, regarded the world with the thoughtful dark eyes he had inherited from his father and the stubborn, capable mouth he had inherited from his mother, and went about the business of being a toddler in a town that had mostly found its better nature. Life in Caldwell in those years was not without its difficulties. The cattle trade continued to bring its complications, conflict over water rights as settlement increased, the occasional drunk and disorderly that required Edwin's firm intervention, the ongoing tension between established settlers and new arrivals, the questions about land and belonging that were never fully resolved along the Indian Territory border, where Edwin tried to operate with more justice than the law always authorized and sometimes succeeded. But there was the school, which Theodora had made into something the town was genuinely proud of. By 1884, she had 12 students and had trained Elena Vasquez as a part-time aide, paying her from the school committee funds she had negotiated with the determination of someone who knows exactly what everything is worth. She had written 3 letters to the State Education Board about the need for a second room, and the third letter had received a favorable response and a commitment to funding, and the day that letter arrived she went to the sheriff's office and set it down on the desk in front of Edwin with the wordless energy of triumph. He read it. He looked up. "A second room," he said. "A second room," she confirmed. He stood up and kissed her with the focus and completeness he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with the warmth she had long since stopped rationing, and Caswell, who walked in at that exact moment, turned around and walked back out without a word and could be heard whistling something cheerful and pointed from the boardwalk. In the spring of 1885, Theodora discovered she was expecting again. James was 3, capable and confident, and already deeply invested in the operations of the sheriff's office, which he considered a satellite of his own personal world. The new child, when he arrived that November, another boy, whom they named Henry after nobody specific, simply because the name felt right and solid, had brown hair and his mother's green eyes, and a disposition of considerable serenity that was such a profound contrast to his brother's exuberance that Theodora occasionally checked on him during the night, just to make sure he was properly there. The 2 boys together were a complete world. James, by the time he was 4, had appointed himself Henry's primary educator, and could be found regularly explaining things to his brother with an authority and thoroughness that his father recognized with complicated pride, and his mother recognized with the specific amusement of seeing someone who is very like herself. Mrs. Mallory declared that the Graves family was the best thing to happen to Caldwell since the railroad, a statement she made publicly at a town meeting in the late summer of 1886 on an entirely different subject, which caused the meeting to briefly detangle from its agenda into something more like a communal acknowledgement of the way certain people change the character of a place simply by being in it. Edwin Graves, standing at the back of the meeting room when this statement was made, looked at his wife sitting 3 rows ahead of him, who had her head turned slightly to hide the fact that she was smiling. He loved her. He had loved her from some point so early in their acquaintance that he had barely admitted it to himself before it was already simply true, and in the years since, the love had not diminished or simplified. It had grown more complex and more complete, the way that real knowledge of a person always makes them more rather than less extraordinary. He knew her impatience, which was specific and directed, never petty. He knew her stubbornness, which was the productive kind. He knew that she cried at books sometimes and was embarrassed about it, and he had never mentioned it because he understood it was private. He knew that she kept her mother's recipe for bread written on a piece of paper folded inside the Bible she kept on the shelf beside her teaching books, and that she sometimes took it out and held it when she was missing her mother, and that she never said so. He knew that she had saved him, which was not a thing he said out loud because it was too large and too true for casual expression, but which he knew. That before her, he had been a man going through the correct motions of a life, doing the right work, serving the right purposes, but enclosed in something he had not known was enclosure until it was gone. That the morning she had walked into his office and told him with complete evenness that Harlan Pruitt had tried to tell her how to do her job and she had declined. He had felt something shift inside him like a key turning in a lock, and everything after that had been the door swinging open. He thought about this on a September evening in 1886, sitting on the porch of their house with the 2 boys asleep inside and Theodora sitting beside him in the chair she had claimed as hers, reading by the last light, and the town going about its quiet evening, and the Kansas sky doing what the Kansas sky did in September, which was to put on a sunset of such extravagant color that it seemed almost embarrassingly generous. "Edwin," she said, without looking up from her book. "Yes." "Are you thinking very loudly over there? I can nearly hear it." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that I am grateful," he said. She set her book down and looked at him. The sunset light was on her face, and she was 33 years old, and she was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life, not because of the light or the year or the evening, but because of the particular quality of her attention, the way her eyes were steady and present and entirely her own. "For what?" she asked. He thought about how to say it. He decided to say it simply. "For all of it, for you specifically, for the key that you picked up." She looked at him for a moment. "I almost didn't pick it up," she said. "I know. I thought you were being reckless." "I was," he agreed. "It was an excellent decision." She smiled at that, a full smile, and reached over to take his hand, and they sat together on the porch of their house in the September evening of Caldwell, Kansas, in 1886, and the sunset burned itself out over the prairie, and the stars came up one at a time, and somewhere inside the house Henry made the small sound he sometimes made in sleep, just a word or two of whatever he was dreaming. And James murmured something back in his own sleep from the other side of the room, as if they were having a conversation, which perhaps they were. Theodora Callahan Graves did not go back to being simply a schoolteacher. She continued teaching, yes. She went on teaching for years, and the school she built in Caldwell became one of the strongest in Sumner County, and there were children who grew up in that town and grew up educated and capable, and went out into the world and made things because she had given them the tools. But she also became something more than that, the way that people who survive their particular test often do. She wrote the letter to the State Education Board about the Indian Territory border situation, the one that several people had tried to write before but had not been in a position to send. She wrote it because she had lived alongside the injustice long enough to know its exact shape, and because Edwin's work had given her access to documentation that most people did not have, and because she was not a woman who saw a wrong clearly and chose not to name it. The letter was one of several that contributed to a formal review of land assignment practices along the southern Kansas border in 1887, A review that did not correct everything. Nothing corrected everything, then as now, but that corrected something, which was the only available increment. She was proud of that. Edwin was proud of her for it. He told her so on the evening she received word that the review had been formally initiated, and he said it the way he always said things, directly and without decoration, and she received it the way she always received things from him, which was to let it settle in fully rather than deflecting it. James Graves, at school age, turned out to be his mother's child in the matter of learning, rapid, comprehensive, somewhat impatient with slower pace, and his father's child in temperament, which meant that the impatience presented in a way that was self-contained rather than outward. Henry, 3 years behind him, was the opposite combination in some ways. He took his time with learning, turned things over and over before he decided what he thought, but was socially easy and warm in a way that gathered other children to him effortlessly. The house on the 2 streets off the main road in Caldwell held all of this: the books and the bread, the star on the vest, and the papers on the desk. The 2 boys growing up in the specific knowledge that their mother was both extraordinary and ordinary, a teacher and a person, a woman who had picked up a key once when she might not have, and had decided from that moment that she would not stop deciding. Edwin Graves served as sheriff of Caldwell until 1890, when a change in the county administration prompted him to step back from the role and take a position as a county magistrate, which suited his particular quality of mind. The deliberateness, the patience, the belief that the distance between knowing and proving should be closed by careful work rather than assumption. It was a role he performed with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understands that the law, at its best, is not about power but about protection, and who has never confused the two. Theodora taught until 1895, when she handed the school to Elena Vasquez, now Elena Morales, married to a carpenter from Wichita, a teacher herself with 2 children, and a quality of professional competence that Theodora recognized as the thing she had most hoped to pass on. She handed the school to Elena with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has built something worth building and is passing it into worthy hands, and Elena received it with a gravity that told Theodora everything she had hoped to know. On the October afternoon when the official transfer was complete and Theodora walked away from the schoolhouse for the last time as its primary teacher, Edwin was waiting on the street outside. He was still Edwin Gray at the temples, now gray throughout, still with the quality of depth and stillness, still with the rare specific smile that she had long since understood was one of the great gifts of her life. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it. "Like someone who has finished a good chapter," she said. "Not the book, just the chapter." "Good," he said. "I have some ideas about the next one." She looked at him. "Do you?" "James has been writing to say he thinks we should come and see Wichita," he said. "He has apparently discovered opinions about the city that he requires our presence to fully express." James was 23 by then, studying law in Wichita at the recently established Kansas Bar Preparation Program, and did indeed have opinions about most things, expressed at length, which both his parents found entirely appropriate. Henry was 20, quiet and steady, working for a surveying company in the summer and studying mathematics in Wichita in the school year, which was a combination that suited him perfectly. "Wichita," Theodora said. "Eventually," Edwin said. "After the harvest fair." "After the harvest fair," she agreed. He took her arm and they walked back through the town of Caldwell together, through the streets that they knew as well as they knew each other's hands, past the general store where Calvin Doss had been replaced by his son, past the boarding house where Mrs. Mallory's granddaughter now ran things, past the sheriff's office where Caswell had himself been sheriff for 3 years and was considered one of the best in the county, past the small frame building that had once been just a single schoolroom and was now 2 rooms and would someday be 3. They walked home through the October afternoon and the light was golden and enormous over the Kansas plain, and the town was the town they had made. Not by themselves, never by themselves, but with the particular contribution that happens when two people decide to hold ground together against forces that would prefer they didn't, and refuse to move. The evening was quiet. James sent a letter that arrived at supper time, full of news about Wichita and a woman he had met named Rose, described in a way that made both his parents look at each other across the table, with the particular expression of people who recognize the early signatures of something significant. Edwin read the letter. Then he set it down. "He sounds," he said carefully, "as though he has met someone." "He does," Theodora agreed. "That's good," Edwin said. "It is," she said. "It's very good." After supper, they sat on the porch again, the way they had sat on the porch 100 September evenings, and the Kansas night settled around them, and the stars came out over the prairie, vast and familiar and unhurried, and Theodora leaned against her husband's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet together in the warm, complete way of people who have built something lasting and know it. She thought about the key sometimes still, small and iron, lying on a desk in the morning light, and the choice it represented, not just the choice to pick it up but everything that choice had been made of. The willingness to trust when trust had costs, to stay when leaving was easier, to stand in the specific place that needed standing in. And she thought about the man who had put it there, not performing boldness but simply being what he was, someone who looked at her and saw her clearly and offered her what she had actually needed, which was not rescue but room. Room to be, room to decide, room to stay. Nobody comes in without your word. He had meant it as protection, which it was. But she had understood it, picking it up as something larger, as a statement of the only kind of love she had ever truly wanted, the kind that does not reduce you, does not contain you, does not ask you to be less in order to be safe. The kind that looks at everything you are and says, all of it, bring all of it. There is room. There had been room. There still was. And in the house behind them, in a drawer of the small writing desk where she still kept her papers, the key was there. She had never given it back. She kept it the way her mother kept the bread recipe, as a piece of the story that she was not willing to lose, the physical mark of a moment that had changed everything. The moment a man with steady gray eyes and silver-touched hair had set a small thing down between them, and offered her the exact right thing at the exact right time, and she had been brave enough to take it. James Thomas Graves was married the following spring in Wichita, to a woman named Rose Hadley who had brown eyes and a quality of direct intelligence that made Theodora like her immediately, and Edwin regard her with the specific approval of a man who has been watching his son's choices, and is relieved that they are good ones. At the wedding, standing with Edwin's hand in hers while their eldest son said the words that would change the shape of his life, Theodora felt the particular compound happiness of a woman who has had the life she chose and watched the life extend itself into the next generation, carrying forward something that had begun on an April morning in 1880 with a train and a valise, and a decision not to be smaller than she was. After the wedding dinner in the quiet of the hotel room with the Wichita evening outside the window, Edwin said, "Do you remember the first time I walked you home?" "I remember everything," she said. "I was terrified," he said. "I do not say that easily." "Of walking me home, of the way I felt about you," he said, which was already at that point completely beyond reasonable management. She turned to look at him, this man at 52 with all the gray now fully settled in and the lines of years and work and weather in his face, and the gray eyes still the same, still that particular pre-storm color, still holding the depth she had noticed from the first. "Edwin," she said. "Yes. I love you very much," she said. Very specifically and very completely. He looked at her for a moment. "As I love you," he said, "also specifically, also completely." He kissed her with the same quality as always, deliberate, attentive, complete. And outside the window Wichita went about its evening, and in the spring air somewhere below them, someone was playing something on a fiddle that drifted up and was improbably appropriate. And Theodora Callahan Graves laughed against her husband's mouth with the full-bodied warmth of a woman who has everything she chose and chose everything she has. And it was very good, and it was very right, and it was fully, finally, completely theirs.